Hi, this is Doug from Dynamic Computing, and welcome to episode 32 of 10-Minute Amiga Retrocast, the Amiga Tutorial Part 2. I would really like to say thanks to everybody who had such nice things to say about the tutorial that I did back in June. I think it's important with people getting back into the Amiga that we have some place to look and remind us of how things are done. So I really appreciate that. I would also like to send out some appreciation to my subscribers. Just this weekend, I reached 1,000 subscribers on my YouTube channel in less than a year. I really appreciate that. I've been having a lot of fun, and I just hope to keep growing it and hope that the videos keep improving over time. I wanted to give a special shout out this week to John and Aaron from the Amigos podcast. They just finished hosting the second annual Amigathon, which was a 14-hour run of Amiga games in which they raised over $3,000 for the Children's Miracle Network. The guys did a great job. It was a lot of fun. There are dozens and dozens and dozens of people involved, and I really enjoyed being part of it. So thanks, guys. You did a good thing. This week, when we continue on with the tutorial, I'm going to be covering some more advanced but some very important things. Things like the shell, which we'll be doing a lot of work with today, HD Toolbox for partitioning your hard drives and setting those up properly. And we're going to be getting into editing the startup sequence and files associated with that so we can learn more about how the Amiga actually works. Let's get right into the goodies. For the moment, we will stick with Workbench and go into the Tools folder and find HD Toolbox. This is a critical tool as it is used to partition your Amiga hard drives and CF cards. So we're going to go to Tools, there's HD Toolbox, scans it, comes right up. Now, there are limitations to how large of a partition you can use on the Amiga, all dependent on which version of the Amiga OS and what kind of hardware you have. Now, if you've got something like an A600 or an A1200 with stock hardware and Amiga OS 3.1, you really need to limit your partition size to less than 4 gigabytes. This may sound small, but remember, back when the Amiga 1200 came out, DOS and Windows was really limited to 2 gigabytes or less. So we were still twice as good as Microsoft. If you try to go beyond 4 gigs, it might seem to function, but it will report incorrect sizes. And if you ever put any data beyond the 4 gigs, you are in a world of trouble. So it is possible to use a larger card or drive sometimes as long as your partitions are below 4 gigs. But to be totally safe, if you're using Amiga OS 3.1 or below, just use a card smaller than 4 gigs. So, does this mean that your Amiga is limited to using small drives? Not at all. If you want to use them, do yourself a favor and invest in Amiga OS 3.1.4 or find a copy of Amiga OS 3.5 or 3.9. All of them have native and built-in support for partitions up to 127 gigs, which is more than enough for the Amiga. And yes, I do know it is possible to use Cloanto's 3.1 kickstarts to support large drives, but from what I understand, it's a bit of a kludge. I have several videos covering Amiga OS 3.1.4, so please refer to those for more info. There's a 16 gig card that I use for my Amiga OS 3.1.4, works absolutely perfect on my Amiga 1200. So let's take a look at our options. So change drive type in HD Toolbox. You're never going to use. It switches between SCSI drives or the older style MFM drives. And when they talk about SCSI on the Amiga, they're really talking about IDE 2. It's just the protocols that they use to communicate. You'll very seldom change your drive type. Modify bad block list is another holdover from an earlier time when hard drives used to ship with a label on them telling you which blocks were bad, and you could enter those. Low-level format, you are very, very seldom going to use this. Now, if you've got a hard drive that comes from another computer with a different operating system, you might have to low-level format before the Amiga will properly be able to partition it. But in general, if it's like a fat file system on a CF card or something like that, you generally don't have to. And in general, you don't ever want to low-level format a CF card. It does squirrely things with it. Very seldom will you use that. Verified data on drive, that searches for bad blocks. Again, holdover from a previous day and age we don't use. Now, all of the fun happens when you go into this Partition Drive button. This is where we can make new partitions, change our filing systems to a newer one, and add buffers to speed up drive access. Now, my workbench is on this 20 megabyte partition here, and we want to use the other 40 megabytes for program and data storage. So we're going to click New Partition. There, we're going to click on where our new partition is, 40 megs. Now, if I wanted to, I could resize this and create multiple partitions, but I'm just going to do one nice big fat 40 meg partition. And then we're going to click down here where it says Change Me, and we're going to give this a name. Now, depending on what you want to do, you can call this whatever you want. This is not the logical name of the drive, like if we wanted to call it work or something like that. That's not what it's talking about. It's talking about DH0, DH1, SDH0, SDH1. That's what this is talking about here. So we're going to, let's take a look at what it's normally called, CF0. We're going to call this one CF1. CF1. You can be as creative as you want with that particular name there, but you can't use things like DF1 or RAM or anything like that. When you're working in the partition manager in here, after you've made a change, always remember to hit the enter key. Like if you just hit CF1 and then go here to advanced options, it's not actually going to remember that. Just remember to hit the enter key when you're done editing something. Under advanced options, we can control the cylinders, end cylinders, everything like that. We do the same thing by dragging this little guy right here. See how that changes them? So you really don't need to do it manually, but you can if you want to. It gives you the option. Buffers is how much RAM is set aside as a cache for your particular hard drive. Now, with a small partition like this, I can easily get away with 250 buffers. If I were using a big drive like a 1 gig or a 2 gig or a 4 gig partition, I might want to go 600, 800, maybe 1,000 buffers up there. You can have multiple bootable partitions on your hard drive if you want to, and then you can change your boot priority to tell Amiga which one to try and boot from first. In this case, we're not going to bother with that. When we click on Change here, there's some very important things. File system, you're only going to change if you're using a custom file system like MS-DOS or PFS, Professional File System. See, there's a couple different ones. In our case, we're going to stick to Fat File System. Changing the block size here is useful if you're using larger drives. You can choose a 1024K block, 2048, 4096, etc. In general, with a small one, 512K is okay. I've got a nice small 20 meg partition or 40 meg partition, so that's fine. If I were going with multi-gigs, I may want to change the block size. Now, this is important here. This is the max transfer. This is a magical number that generally needs to be changed, and that is basically how much data can be transferred at one time. And the number we want to use is 0x1 FE00. So we're going to do 0x1 FE00. Now, there's been a lot of debate over the years about changing that to something else to increase the performance, but this is a safe number here. Okay, we're going to click OK to go out of here. Add an update file system. Right now we're using Fast File System 44.6. If we needed to use a newer version, we could upgrade it by clicking Update File System, and it would give us some choices for updating the file system. We're not going to do that now. We're going to stick with the file system from 3.1. We're going to click OK. We're going to click OK again. Now you notice the status has changed to change here. So we're going to save the changes on the drive and exit. Now I'm going to reboot and hopefully we'll be able to see our new partition. Now here you see we've got CF1 as basically an invalid drive now because we've not formatted it. Now last episode we talked about how we can format drives, so we're going to go ahead and do that from Workbench. We're going to call this one work because I always call my second drives my work drives. Trash can, fast file system, international mode, and we'll do directory cache too. 40 meg capacity, quick format, and away we go. And it just takes a moment, and now our work drive is formatted and ready to go with 40 megabytes free. Yippee skippy. Now that we know a little bit more about hard drives, let's jump into the real powerhouse of the Amiga, the command line interface, also known as the CLI or the shell. It normally resides in your Workbench disk in the System folder. So there's my Workbench, there's System, and there's Shell. We're going to go ahead and open that up. There we go. When you launch the shell, it will generally reflect the current drive you're working on. In my case, the WB500 drive. Changing to another drive to work in is fundamental and incredibly easy. You simply type the name of the drive you want to see. For example, DF0 for the internal floppy drive. So we're going to type DF0 and a colon, and it automatically changes and shows me my floppy drive. Now we can do a directory and see what's on the floppy. Now we're going to switch to RAM. Notice the floppy drive's name is CF Files. We'll switch over to the RAM drive and look inside there. Okay, now I can switch back to that floppy drive, not just by going to DF0, but also by typing in the name of the disk itself. CF Files, and the Amiga knows to open up DF0. We just created my new work drive. We're going to go to work, and right there, bing bang boom, it knows to go to the work drive. These file names are not case sensitive, but you always have to put the colon at the end. If you don't put the colon at the end, it will think that you're trying to look at a file and it won't function. Now notice I can go into specific directories that same way. I just ran a directory on my floppy drive, my CF Files. Here's a folder called CFD133. I don't even have to type CD for change directory, although I could. CFD133, and it lets me write into that specific directory. We'll list it up. There we go. Now if I want to go back, I can type CD backspace, kind of like you do in Windows, or we'll go back in. You can just hit the backspace and it takes you right out of it. I'm sorry, the backslash, and it takes you right out of it. So that's pretty cool. Once you've typed in some commands, you can use the up arrow key and the down arrow key to cycle through all of the commands that you've already used, which is kind of nice. If you've made a mistake on a long copy command, you can just hit the up arrow to go back to it and edit the mistake. Now let's take a look at the dir and the list commands. Very powerful. The dir command will just list what is in the current directory. List will do the same thing, but it brings you a lot more information. It shows you the size of the file. It shows you the read-write attributes of it. It shows you the date and time, which is probably always going to be wrong because so few of our Amigas have clocks that work anymore. We ripped those batteries out. So it's a much more extensive command. Now, wildcards can be used to list only certain things, but unlike Windows and DOS, instead of an asterisk as a wildcard, the hashtag and question marks are used. So if I wanted to look at just LHA files here, we're going to type dir and then hashtag question mark .lha, and it's only going to come back with the particular LHA file. I could do that for .info files. I could do that for any kind of file I wanted to. Now let's take a look at a bigger drive for a second. And with the commands like dir, if you don't know what sub options you can use, you type in the command and then a question mark after it. And you can do that for almost any command with Amiga DOS. This tells me I have options of like all, dirs, files. So if I want to do dir all, it is going to go through every single folder and file on my auxiliary disk and show me the contents of every single folder in there. If we don't want to see it all, we hit Control-C, we can break right out of there. You can also redirect the contents of something like this to another device. So if I do dir all, point it to PRT for printer. If I had a printer connected, it would send that directly to the printer. With some versions of Amiga OS, you could send it to speak and it would talk back to you, but you have to actually have the files loaded in to do that. Another useful function is dir to a file name. So we're going to call this filelist.txt. Now, it's actually generating that entire directory and list of files, but it's sending it to an actual text file that I could then import into my word processing program or bring over to my Windows machine so I could analyze what's on my particular disks. Let's get out of there and let's take a look at it. We're going to do type filelist.txt, and now it's actually just typing out that text file. This isn't actually reading the directory, it's reading that text file. You can make a new directory with the make dir command. Now, you'll notice when we do this, it will not create an icon for the directory. Let's play with a floppy drive for a minute. And we're going to make a new directory in here. So we're going to do make dir test. Okay, so now on my floppy drive, there's a new folder called test. But if we go here and we look on the actual floppy, we won't see a folder called test unless we do our show all files. And there's test, okay? Because it's not an actual icon, it's just a command line directory. Let's go back in here. Now what happens if we want to create an icon for that test folder? Well, we can do that easily. We know that there's already an icon for this file called CFD133. We've seen it when we look at the floppy disk, so we know there's this folder called CFD133. Look what we can do here. We can copy CFD133.info, which is this file here, the actual icon that relates to that folder. We're going to copy that to test.info. It's copying over just the icon file. We can do a directory here. We see there's a test.info. Now look what happens on our floppy when I update this. Now the test folder has a perfectly usable icon associated with it. Now, of course, I could have just gone in Workbench and created a new drawer and it creates an icon automatically for it. But there are times when you run into folders that have already been created that you want to make an icon for, and that's how you do it. Now we can do the same thing with files. Look at me, I'm so neat and tidy. I keep closing down my floppy folder and I want to keep it open. Now there is a file called fat95.lha. It has no icon here. We can do the same thing. We're going to just grab this trash can icon just for fun and copy trashcan.info over to fat95.lha.info. See what I'm doing there? File extensions mean something a little different on an Amiga. I meant to update. Now here, now we have our FAT95 LHA that is actually using the trash can icon. It even copied both the open and the closed version of the trash can. Now from here, you could go into the icon editor that we looked at a few weeks ago, edit that icon, change it to anything you want to. So any file on the Amiga disk structure can be given an icon just by copying the icon from another file. Now, if we want to get rid of that icon, no problem. Delete fat95.lha.info. This is not deleting the LHA file. It's not deleting that at all. It's only deleting the icon. And now when I update my disk, no more fat95.lha file on there, but it is still happily on the floppy disk, just with no icon. Now this is a great command line to use too. This one is called avail, and it will show you how much chip RAM you have, how much fast RAM you have, and how much of each type is in use. So if you're trying to free up space to run a particular program, you can go into the command line, you can type avail, and you can see what's being used, as well as your total amount of memory. You can also look at just specific memory. Avail chip, 1,984,896 bytes, and then avail fast shows just the fast RAM, and this one, avail flush, will clear out some fonts, clear out some libraries, and try and glean a little bit more space. Like I've got another 12, 16 kilobytes of memory that I was able to get by using avail flush. So if you're tight on RAM for something, you can use avail flush to try and get a little bit back. Next, we're going to look at info. Info brings up a list of all of your drives on your Amiga. And the nice thing is, it shows the actual name of the device, RAM, CF0, DF0, DF1, CF aux, and it also shows the virtual name, RAM disk, WB500, CF files. So if you've got a lot of folders or directories or whatnot, and you can't remember your name that you gave it, you can do an info, and it will relate the two of them together. CF0 is WB500, CF1 is work, and so on. It also shows you the size of it, and it shows you how much space is free and how much has been used, which is kind of nice. Now you'll notice in my CF aux, because it's Amiga OS 3.1 and it's working with a fat file system on that particular CF card, it confuses the daylights out of it. It works perfect, but some utilities are confused. When I do the same thing on Amiga OS 3.1.4, it sees the file size just fine. You can also do info of just a specific drive, and it'll pull the information up just for that specific drive. Actually, a very useful command. Next command I want to talk about is the copy command. It is a critical command. You can actually easily back up your entire Amiga partition with a simple copy command. So let's say we just wanted to copy an entire folder from our floppy drive over to our RAM drive. We're going to do copy. There's the folder we want, CFD133. All right, now I don't need any wildcards after that. And then where's it going to go? It's going to go to RAM. Now pay attention to this. We have to tell it CFD133. If we don't put that in there, it will copy the contents of it to the root of the RAM drive without creating the subfolder. This right here tells us to create a subfolder. Now next command is going to be clone, which is going to copy over all of the attributes of those files, and then the word all, which is going to copy everything inside that directory. So right now it's going through and it's literally copying every single file right over to the RAM disk. Let's go look in RAM, do a directory. There's CFD133. Let's go into CFD133. And there's all of our files we just copied over from the floppy drive to the RAM drive with a simple copy command. Now, to quite literally make a full backup of your entire operating system, I've got, it's only 4 megabytes, so it's not big, but your entire Workbench partition can be copied to a new device in a heartbeat. All you have to do is copy sys, which is what the shortcut name is for your Workbench. Okay, so copy sys over to your destination. We're going to go to xfer 500. This is my auxiliary CF card. We're going to call this folder Workbench Backup. Okay, clone. Oh, it is literally now taking everything off my boot partition and copying it into a folder on my secondary compact flash drive. All right, if you've got an Amiga 1200, it is easy peasy lemon squeezy to use a secondary flash drive with a PCMCIA adapter. You can make a backup of your entire operating system in minutes. Now, what you can do after this is I could go in and delete my entire Workbench partition. Just boom, gone, erased. Then I boot back up via a floppy disk, maybe resize my partition, maybe down to a 15 meg partition. All right. Then I just use the copy command to copy it from this folder, all the contents, back onto my boot floppy, or back onto my boot partition. Make sure it's bootable. Reboot the Amiga. Done. You've just restored your entire operating system. The whole thing takes like 5 minutes, maybe 10 minutes total. It is beautiful. The assign command is a very, very powerful command. Let's actually play with that a little bit. We're going to create a new folder on our new work drive, and we're going to call this folder Documents. I want an icon there, so I'm creating it in Workbench instead of having to copy stuff over. Excellent. So now we've got our Documents folder, and I want to save documents in there on a regular basis, but I don't want to have to keep putting in the path for that particular folder. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go assign docs, put a colon there, and then the path that you're assigning it to, work colon documents. All right, now anytime I go docs, it's going to go directly to that works documents folder. So let's go back to our floppy, and we're going to take a look, and we want to copy the fat95.lha over to the documents folder. Copy fat95 to docs. So instead of having to type work colon documents to move it there, I just send it in my docs file. Now every program that I use will be able to see that docs file with no issues at all. So now we go back to docs. There's our FAT95 document. Now, if I decide to launch a program, we're going to go into the word processor here, ProWrite, and I've got happy, a nice document, and I want to save it. I can look at disks down here. Look at that, docs. And we're going to call this one happy. Do a directory. There's happy, created an icon too. So it shows up as a virtual shortcut without having to dig through all your disks. Assign is an incredibly powerful command. Now you can also type assign all by itself and see what shortcuts are currently assigned. Let's take a look at that. We can see docs is a shortcut to work documents. Locale, Workbench 500 locale, key maps, clips, there's S. We can see all of our current assigns, and we can see our current devices. Now if we reboot this computer, we're going to lose that assign called docs to work documents. It'll be gone because we just typed it in. It's only going to remember it for this session. So how do we make that permanent? What we do is we edit our startup sequence. Now the startup sequence is a unique file. You can think of it like an autoexec.bat file in DOS or the bloated and out of control registry in Windows. It's an executable script file, and normally script files are in the S folders. And by looking at our assigns, we can see that S already has an assign, workbench 500 S. Great. We can type S:, do a dir. Look, there's our startup sequence. Now, what can we do with this thing? I'm going to teach you how to use the built-in editor called ed to get access to this file and to modify it. There are absolutely much better editors available for Amiga OS. We'll be going over those in another episode. But ed is built in, and when your Amiga won't boot properly and you can only get to a command line, you need to know how to use ed so you can access your startup sequence. Now, let me show you how it works. ed is a reasonably powerful but somewhat archaic text editor. Gets the job done, and you need to know a few key commands to use it. Now, I like to use run ed. What the run command does is it runs the ed program in a separate instance. It doesn't keep it tied to this Amiga shell. So when we load it up, we can still go back here and do stuff in our shell if we want to, and ed still runs in the background. Okay? Now, if I don't use the run command, we're just going to do ed. You see, it locks up my shell, and I can't do anything on it. I can't type anything on it until after I get out of ed, and then it frees the shell up again. I just like to use the run command. It just keeps things nice and neat and lets you multitask very nicely. So you can see this new screen that shows the default Amiga OS 3.1 startup sequence. If you're ever mucking around on your Amiga and suddenly it won't boot to Workbench, chances are that something is going on in your startup sequence that's screwing things up, and fixing things will solve the problem. We'll go into that more in a moment. Let's take a look at the startup sequence at exactly what it does. The semicolon is just a remark statement that tells you what it is. Set patch goes in and it patches the ROMs. It takes software on the hard drive and patches certain utilities in ROM. Version to nil, not particularly important. It's adding some of those buffers to the floppy drive to speed up floppy access. Here we're making directories in the RAM drive. Amiga OS moves a lot of important things over to the RAM drive almost immediately, like the envarc where all your prefs are saved. It copies those to the RAM drive in the interest of speed and in the interest of actually not having to access your floppy all the time. Now here, it's making these commands resident. Resident means it takes these commands and it actually saves them into the memory of the Amiga, so when it executes these commands, it does not need to pull them up off of the disk. You can make many commands resident if you want. Dir, list, ed, whatever you want to. You could do this yourself to make commands resident. It allows them to execute faster. Not quite as important when you're dealing with a hard drive, but if you've got a floppy only system, it can make it run a little more streamlined. Now here are our current assign statements. This is where it gives assigns to specific things. It wants to assign env to RAM, key maps to devs key maps. Here's where we can put our little assign command in. Assign to nil. Now you notice that it's putting these assigns over into nil. And what nil is nil is an alternate dimension where when you run this particular file, it sends all of the output from that file to that alternate dimension called nil. So they're probably overrun over there with the results of 30 years of Amiga command line use. We're we're going to put this, let's see, work, documents. This means that every time it runs the startup sequence when you boot, it's automatically going to assign. Look at this, I made a mistake. I have to tell it what the assign is first. Assign docs to work, documents. There we go. Glad I caught that before I hit enter. Now down here, it's loading up monitor drivers, loading a couple of little utilities that it runs in the background. It adds some path commands. Now here, if exists, s:\user startup. User startup is where most programs you install on your Amiga will add their things, like their assigns and their custom programs that need to run. It's a separate text file, a separate script that you can use and put your own information in, just like this, that doesn't screw around with the startup sequence. It leaves the main startup sequence alone. Now, we're pretty safe just putting a couple of assigns or two in here into the startup sequence, but if we were going to be running some serious stuff on startup, I would definitely create this file called user startup and let it execute that. It removes those resident files here to save some memory. I could remove those and it would keep those two in memory all the time. It wouldn't really matter, just use a little RAM. Load workbench is the last command here that loads the workbench program. And then lastly, it ends the command line. Now when you're done, and what we want to do is hit escape and then the letters S-A and enter. And that's going to save whatever changes we've made in here. Now we hit escape Q to exit out of the ed program. That's going to be important in a minute with what I'm going to show you. Now let's say our Amiga won't boot. When you reboot the Amiga, you hold down the left and the right mouse buttons, and it's going to get you into this special startup menu. There we go. You'll see you have some options. Boot options will allow you to choose which device to boot from or disable certain devices from being seen. Display options switches between NTSC and PAL, mostly on AGA Amigas, but I think it'll work on ECS too. This switches between the original chipset and the enhanced chipset. Expansion board diagnostic will tell you if your expansion boards are working, but what we care about is boot with no startup sequence. This is what you want to use if your Amiga is not booting properly, so you can go into the startup sequence and fix things that are messed up. Oftentimes it'll be something like a set patch or something that needs to be tweaked. Now here, you'll notice it's not showing us the drives that we are normally able to see. We can still see them, but as we switch to them, it does not change the name here, so you kind of have to know where you're going. I'm going to go back to S, which should be where my startup sequence is. Yep. Run ed startup sequence. And now we can go in and we can fix or remove anything in our startup sequence or in our user startup that's possibly causing the Amiga not to boot. When you're done, escape Q gets you right out of there, and then you can just reboot your machine. Okay, back into Workbench. Let's say you're stubborn as a mule and you can't be bothered to learn any of these new command names. You want to use the command names that you're used to using on your existing OS. Well, with the Amiga, you don't have to. You can use the Alias Command to change how you interact with the command line. For example, you're used to typing scumbunny on your OS to get a directory listing instead of dir. Fine. We're going to do alias scumbunny dir. Now, anytime we type in scumbunny, it's going to give us a full directory, and it's going to use all of the switches that dir normally uses. So we can do scumbunny question mark. It gives us all of our options. No problem at all. The dir command still works fine. No issue there. It's just creates an alias in the Amiga OS for that particular command. Kind of cool if you're used to using things a specific way, like a real life situation would be a lot of people use ls for list, and so they will make an alias of ls for the list command. Works out really nice. Aren't you glad you know where to put that alias command if you want to customize your Amiga and have it start automatically on startup? I know you know how to do it because I just taught you. New shell will launch a new shell program, just like it sounds. Both of them work at the same time. So dir all, both of them are doing their thing at exactly the same time, running and sharing the Amiga's resources to read the directories. When you're done with a particular shell, you can just break right out of it, exit out of it if you want to. You can use new shell or new CLI for that. If you want to get out of here, of course you can use the little gadget up there, or you can do end shell or end CLI, and it will end it for you. The shell is very powerful, and it really just scratches the surface of what we can do with it. But it's a good start, and it should take care of a majority of your shell needs. There are many shell enhancements out there, some of them bundled with Amiga OS 3.1.4, that improve the capabilities of it dramatically, and I'll cover those later. In the next installment of this series, I'm going to be covering some of the most important add-ons that you can get for Amiga OS 3.1 to add features, add capabilities, and be able to do more with your Amiga. Don't forget to like and subscribe. Now that I've hit the 1,000 subscriber mark, I want to keep the momentum going. Please follow me on Twitter at 10mark1. But until next time, this is Doug from 10 Minute Amiga Retrocast, signing out.